The library book that shouldn't exist. A Miss Marple mystery setting. Thornwick-on-Fen, Cambridgeshire. Year 1952. Chapter 1. The Autumn Book Fair and the Lady Who Noticed Things. The village of Thornwick-on-Fen had been preparing for its autumn book fair since the second week of September, and by the time Saturday the 4th of October arrived with its pale morning light and its smell of dry leaves and chimney smoke, the parish hall had been transformed into something that resembled, to the charitable eye, a very well-organised library sale, and to the uncharitable eye, a paper avalanche caught at the moment of impact. Trestle tables ran the length of the hall in 2 long rows, draped with cloths in various degrees of whiteness, and upon them were arranged somewhere in the neighbourhood of 3,000 volumes, in conditions that ranged from pristine, tissue-wrapped and gently placed, to barely legible, their spines cracked, and their pages spotted with the brown freckles of age. The Women's Institute had donated 47 novels, many of them romances of the sort that were read once and passed on without regret. The vicar, Reverend Drummond, had parted reluctantly with a near-complete set of Dickens, minus only Bleak House, which he confessed he had attempted 5 times without success, and therefore felt unable to endorse as a donation in good conscience. The Thornwick Primary School had contributed 2 full boxes of annuals from the 1930s, which smelled powerfully of damp attic, and were purchased within the first 40 minutes by Mr. Pocock, a retired schoolmaster, who said the smell brought back his boyhood in Norfolk in a way he found almost indecently pleasant. It was, in all its particulars, a perfectly ordinary village occasion, the sort of thing that happened in the villages of the English countryside every autumn without incident or remark, and would continue to happen until time and English weather between them had their final word. There was nothing in the morning to suggest that by evening Miss Jane Marple would be sitting in her cottage with a library register reference memorized and a quietly alarming theory forming itself in the orderly back rooms of her mind. Miss Marple arrived at 10:30, having walked the quarter-mile from her cottage on Fen Lane with a canvas bag on one arm and a firm intention to find something by Josephine Tay, whose name she had seen recommended in a magazine, and whose work she had not yet had the pleasure of encountering. She was 71 years old, white-haired, of slight build, and possessed of the mild blue eyes behind rimless spectacles that people invariably associated with comfortable elderly ladies, and that had misled a remarkable number of people over the years. She wore a grey wool coat that had attended several previous book fairs, a sensible hat, and the expression of a woman who had come to enjoy herself and expected to do so. Nobody paid her particular attention when she came in, which suited her entirely. The parish hall was pleasantly full by the time she arrived. Near the entrance, Mrs. Frobisher from the post office presided over the baked goods table with the brisk authority of a woman who has managed people all her life and considers a charity tea a logistics operation requiring her personal supervision. She was dispensing cups of strong reddish-brown tea and slices of Victoria sponge with a speed and certainty that brooked no argument about preferences. Miss Marple accepted a cup gratefully, exchanged 2 minutes of warm village conversation, and moved on into the hall. She paused at the first table of fiction, leafed through several volumes, found nothing that detained her, and moved along. At the travel books table she encountered the Kavanagh sisters, Iris and Philippa, who had driven over from the neighbouring village of Maltham, and were examining a large illustrated volume on the Norwegian fjords with the intense seriousness of women who are considering an expedition they will never actually take. Miss Marple greeted them warmly, admired their selection, and moved on. Near the reference section, young Dr. Harcastle was standing with a copy of Gray's Anatomy open in his hands, studying something with an expression of professional concentration. He was new to the village, only 8 months in Thornwick, and Miss Marple had not yet formed a complete impression of him, though what she had so far suggested a thorough and conscientious man who asked more questions than his patients strictly liked. At the far end of the hall, the most prestigious table was managed by Mr. Aubrey Fitch, who was the librarian of the Thornwick Village Library and who treated the autumn book fair as the single most culturally significant event in the village calendar. He was a dry, precise man of 55, with wire-rimmed spectacles, carefully parted grey hair, and an absolute intolerance for books shelved in the wrong order, pages bent at their corners, or volumes left with their spines upward. He had organised the fair for 11 consecutive years, and was considered its institutional memory, its arbiter of disputed donations, and its chief authority on whether something counted as a book worth having. His table held the finest donated volumes, the leather-bound sets, the illustrated editions, the signed copies, the items of some modest, genuine worth. It was at Mr. Fitch's table that Miss Marple paused, her progress arrested not by the full leather-bound set of Trollope on the right, nor by the handsome illustrated Boswell in the centre, nor by the rather distinguished run of Edwardian travel memoirs in matching cloth bindings on the left, but by a single slim volume at the extreme left end of the table, lying flat rather than standing upright, as though it had been set there in some haste, or placed by someone who had not quite decided what to do with it. She picked it up. It was a diary, a personal journal, bound in green Moroccan leather, with a small brass clasp on the right-hand side. The clasp was not locked. It sat at the closed position, but yielded easily when she pressed it. On the inside front cover, in a neat, educated, deliberate hand, the hand of a man accustomed to writing and careful about how he did it, were the words, "Property of R. Ashwood, Private." Beneath this, a date range, March 1949, September 1950. Miss Marple stood very still for a moment, her expression entirely unchanged, the mild, pleasant expression of a woman examining an interesting find at a charity sale. She turned the first few pages slowly. She did not read the entries. That would have been an impropriety she had no intention of committing in a public hall. But she registered several things with the quiet efficiency that came naturally to a woman who had spent her life noticing. The handwriting was consistent throughout, careful, medium in size, the hand of someone who thought as he wrote, and wrote as he thought. Several pages near the back of the diary had been removed, torn out, not carefully cut, leaving rough stubs along the inner spine, where the pages had been pulled away with some force. The missing pages numbered, by her estimate, somewhere between 8 and 12. They had not fallen out. The stubs were clearly torn, with the characteristic uneven edge of a page removed by hand in haste or urgency. And on the front cover, the green Moroccan leather, in the lower right corner, there was a small circular stamp mark. The ink had faded almost entirely, bleached by 2 or 3 years of time and handling, but the circular outline and what appeared to be text within it were still just visible to someone who was looking carefully. A library stamp of some kind, the sort of mark with which lending libraries identified their stock. Miss Marple closed the diary very gently and set it back on the table, precisely as she had found it. Mr. Fitch was at the other end of his table, engaged in what appeared to be a diplomatic but firm refusal to accept the donation of 3 well-worn paperback romances from a stout woman who seemed genuinely surprised that not everything was welcome. Miss Marple waited with patience. She had a great deal of patience, of the active, watchful variety, and when his attention became available, she said pleasantly, "Mr. Fitch, good morning. What a fine selection you've assembled." "Miss Marple," he adjusted his spectacles. "Good morning. I hope you're finding things satisfactory." "Quite satisfactory, yes, thank you. I was looking at this." She indicated the diary with a light touch. "It seems rather personal in nature. Was it intended for the sale?" Mr. Fitch looked at the diary. It was a very ordinary look, the look of a librarian examining a donated item for condition and suitability. And then, for a period of time that could not have been more than half a second, something happened behind that look. Something shifted, or tightened, or recalculated itself. Then the ordinary look was back, smooth and professional. "I believe it came in with the Ashwood donation," he said. "A box of books from Raven House. The Ashwood property on the Marsh Road, sold last spring. I suspect the diary was included accidentally when the house was being cleared. It ought to go back to the family, really." "The Ashwood family," Miss Marple said, with the tone of a woman encountering an unfamiliar name. "I don't believe I know them. They were not long in Thornwick. The father, Roland Ashwood, died in the spring of 1950. An accident, I believe. His wife and son left very soon after. The property stood empty for a year or two before the Penistons bought it." "How sad," said Miss Marple. "These things happen, of course, with a village property. The stamp on the cover, is that your library's mark? It's quite faint." The half-second pause. The smoothing of the professional look. "It might be. Materials from a long-term borrower sometimes acquire a stamp if they're brought into the building regularly. Easily done." "Of course," said Miss Marple, warm and entirely undemanding. "These things do happen so easily." She moved on, and within 15 minutes had found the Josephine Tay she had come for, A Daughter of Time, which struck her at once as a very interesting title, and a Wodehouse she did not strictly need but purchased without internal argument on the grounds that there were worse things to do with a shilling. She spent another half-hour browsing pleasurably and talking to various people, and left the fair at noon with her canvas bag satisfactorily full. But the diary stayed in her mind, with the persistent quality of a detail that refuses to be filed away as unimportant. She had learned, over many years, to take these persistent details very seriously indeed. Chapter 2. Tea, Mrs. Frobisher, and the Marsh Road. After the book fair, the custom among Thornwick's female population of a certain generation was to gather at one of several kitchens for an informal debriefing, a discussion of what had been found, what had been paid, and what one's neighbours had said that was worth remembering. Miss Marple, who was new to Thornwick compared to most of its long-term residents but had established herself warmly over 6 years, was generally included in these gatherings, and on this particular Saturday she found herself at Mrs. Frobisher's kitchen table at 1:30, with a second cup of tea and a plate of shortbread between them. Mrs. Frobisher was an institution in Thornwick. She was 63, sturdily built, quick-eyed, with hair that was more iron than grey, and the efficient directness of a woman who has run a post office for 25 years and has no patience for ambiguity or indirection. She knew everything about everyone in the village in the way that certain people in certain positions come to know things, not because they seek information out, but because information is simply what flows through their hands every day, and it would take conscious effort not to notice it. "Raven House," she said without hesitation, when Miss Marple introduced the topic with a remark about interesting donations at the fair. "On the Marsh Road, yes. Dark sort of property, always was. Not in a dramatic way, but the location, you know. Too near the fen, too much damp. The garden just running into the marshland at the back. Colonel Carfax had it for years and years, kept it in some order, but he died in 1946 and left no family to speak of, and it sat empty until 1949. When the Ashwoods came. Roland Ashwood was the husband, Cambridge man, academic of some sort, though nobody quite knew what his subject was. He was quiet, kept to himself, went to the library rather than to the pub, which told you something about his character in this village. His wife Vera was more sociable. She came to the WI twice in those first months. Nice woman, quiet but warm, musical, I think. She seemed a little lost, as newcomers sometimes do. And they had a child, a boy, Philip, 12 or 13 when they arrived. He attended the primary school but was rather withdrawn. Clever, his teacher said, but not easy to reach. Children often reflect their parents' anxieties, of course. And Roland Ashwood died in 1950? April, the 15th, I believe. He went out after dinner, His wife told the inquest he'd said he was restless and wanted some air, which is the sort of thing people say when they want to be alone and don't want to explain why. And the next morning, she found him at the bottom of the stone steps at the back of the house. The fen garden steps, they were old, uneven, dangerously close to the drop where the garden ended and the fen began. Everyone who'd ever seen them said they were treacherous. And the inquest said it was an accident, an accidental fall. Dr. Merritt, he was the village doctor then, retired to Lincolnshire now, said it was consistent with a fall. The coroner agreed. There was nothing, officially, to suggest anything else. Miss Marple drank her tea. Was there anything, unofficially, to suggest anything else? Mrs. Frobisher was quiet for a moment, which for her was unusual. She chose her words with care. There was talk, the way there always is. Two things, mainly. One was that someone had seen Roland Ashwood walking along the fen road that evening, which is in the opposite direction from the house steps, which might mean nothing. He might have changed his mind and turned back. The other was that his research papers were gone. His wife went to the library within a few days of the inquest to ask about materials he'd left there, and Mr. Fitch said there was nothing. She was very upset about it, said his whole life's work had simply vanished. His research papers had vanished, so she said, though she was in considerable distress, and things in such a state sometimes turn up later, in places one had forgotten to look. Miss Marple set down her cup. What was his research about? That I couldn't tell you precisely. Historical something. Local history, people said. He was often seen out on the fen paths with a notebook. Vera told someone once that he was writing a book, but she said he kept the details very private. It was, apparently, sensitive in some way. Sensitive. Miss Marple repeated the word with the tone of a woman trying its weight. Mr. Fitch knew him, of course, through the library. Oh, they had a close arrangement. Ashwood was a heavy borrower, and Fitch had given him a special extended loan on account of the research. He was apparently in and out of the library very regularly. Fitch was quite accommodating with him, which was notable because Fitch is not, as a general rule, especially accommodating. No, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. He is not. She walked home through the afternoon with the diary more firmly in her mind than ever. A man of private research habits who kept his work secret even from his wife. A Cambridge academic in a small village, working on something sensitive. Research papers that vanished after his death. And a library stamp. A stamp that belonged to the very library that had arranged special access for his work, on the inside cover of his private diary. Miss Marple was a woman who had knitted a great deal over her life, and she knew that when a thread presents itself at the edge of a pattern, the only productive thing to do is to follow it. Chapter 3. The Library and the Librarian. The Thornwick Village Library occupied the ground floor of a converted Georgian building on the High Street, between the chemist's and the old solicitor's office that had belonged to the Pemberton family for as long as anyone could remember. It held, at the last count Miss Marple had heard Mr. Fitch cite with proprietary pride, 4,217 volumes, a periodical section updated weekly, and a reading room at the back with 3 leather chairs of varying degrees of comfort. The best chair, a deep, properly upholstered armchair near the east window, was informally acknowledged as Miss Marple's when she chose to use it, which was a testament to her 12 years of reliable and respectful borrowing. She arrived on Monday morning at 10 o'clock, with 2 overdue volumes under her arm, and a perfectly natural reason to be there. Mr. Fitch was at his desk behind the counter, working through what appeared to be the acquisition records for a recent journal delivery, and he greeted her with his standard professional courtesy, the warm but efficient manner of a librarian who genuinely likes books and is honestly trying to be pleasant to the people who borrow them, even when those people return things late. Good morning, Miss Marple. I see you have 2 returns. Yes, those were due last Thursday. I know, I'm dreadfully sorry, Mr. Fitch. I got entirely absorbed in the second one. That is the appropriate response to a good book. he said, with a hint of warmth that was entirely genuine. "The fine is 4p total, and I have the reservation you placed last month. It came in on Friday." He retrieved the reserved book, a detective novel she had forgotten placing, and Miss Marple thanked him and paid her fine. Then, in the tone of a woman continuing a pleasant conversation rather than beginning a new one, she said, "I was thinking again about that diary from the fair. The Ashwood one. Have you decided what to do with it?" "I've set it aside," Mr. Fitch said. "I mean to write to Mrs. Ashwood, Vera Ashwood, if I can find a forwarding address for her. It ought to go back to the family. That is very conscientious, though of course after 2 years she may not feel the urgency. Perhaps not. But one should try to do the right thing." "Of course," said Miss Marple warmly. "I noticed, when I looked at it at the fair, that several pages had been removed from near the back, torn out. It seemed rather a pity. The diary otherwise appeared very complete." She said this in the mildest possible tone, and she watched Mr. Fitch while she said it with the same quality of attention she gave to her garden when she suspected something was wrong with a plant. Not staring, not pointed, simply present and observant. His hands, which were straightening a stack of returned books on the counter, paused. A half-second, exactly a half-second, she was certain, and then they continued, smooth and professional. "I hadn't noticed that," he said. "The diary came in with a box of other materials. I didn't examine it closely. Of course, there must have been a great deal to sort through from the donation. 3 boxes, I heard. Something like that. I made a special trip to the house when the Penistons were clearing it. They very kindly allowed me to look through the library before the general clearance. How fortunate. Valuable things get lost in general clearances." She said this very pleasantly, and moved on immediately to asking about the availability of certain reference volumes, and the conversation returned smoothly to ordinary library matters. She paid another small fine, reserved a second volume, and left. On the pavement outside she stood for a moment in the thin October sun, organizing her thoughts. The half-second pause was the important thing. Miss Marple had been visiting this library for 12 years, and in 12 years she had never once seen Mr. Fitch's hands hesitate over a library task. He was a man of extraordinary professional habit. His movements at the counter were as practiced and automatic as a surgeon's, and a half-second break in that pattern was not caused by an absent thought or a mild distraction. It was caused by the sudden intrusion of something that did not belong in the professional context, a sharp moment of consciousness, the kind produced by information that one did not want to receive in exactly the way one had just received it. He had known about the torn pages before she mentioned them. She was certain of it. She walked home and began to knit a complicated pattern, which was her preferred method of sustained thought. Chapter 4. The Reading Group and its Revelations. The fortnightly Tuesday reading group at the Thornwick Library had 8 regular members, and Miss Marple attended each session with the particular pleasure of a woman who reads carefully enough to have genuine opinions, and who finds that other people's opinions, even when she disagrees with them, are informative about something beyond the books under discussion. On the Tuesday following the book fair, she arrived early, which was her custom, to help arrange the reading room chairs and to be part of the preparatory conversations that often yielded more than the formal discussion itself. The reading room's 3 leather chairs and 5 wooden ones were arranged in a rough circle, and Miss Marple established herself in the comfortable armchair, her unofficial armchair, and set her copy of the month's novel on her lap, and waited for people to arrive. The first to appear was Clara Hartley, who was 70, and had lived in Thornwick since birth, and remembered every person and event of note for the last 50 years. She was partly deaf in a selective way that people who knew her well suspected was not entirely uncontrollable, wore a hearing trumpet she rarely troubled to use, and had the long, clear memory of the very old for things that had happened decades ago, combined with a somewhat unreliable memory for things that had happened last week. She sat beside Miss Marple, and immediately began to discuss the relative merits of various tea cakes available in the village, which was always a safe opening topic. George Pemberton arrived next. He was the village solicitor, or rather the second generation of Pemberton solicitors. His father had founded the practice, and George had joined it after qualifying, and had taken it over entirely since his father's retirement 5 years ago. He was 38, compact, well-dressed in a quiet, expensive way that was noticeable in a village setting, with brown eyes that were quick and intelligent behind an exterior of relaxed professional courtesy. He greeted the room generally, found a wooden chair, and opened his copy of the novel with the manner of a man who has read it and formed his opinions and is prepared to share them. Mrs. Vera Norcott was the last to arrive before Mr. Fitch himself. She had come to Thornwick in the summer of 1951, a widow of about 45, quietly pretty in a faded way, with dark hair going grey at the temples, and eyes that were grey-green and intelligent, and habitually somewhat guarded. She taught piano lessons at the primary school 3 days a week, and lived alone in a small cottage behind the church, and she was friendly in a general way, without being intimate with anyone in the village, which several people had noticed and attributed to recent widowhood. Miss Marple had noticed it too, but had also noticed something else. Mrs. Norcott had the manner of someone who was watching, rather than simply living. Not unpleasantly, not in any way that others seemed to detect, but there was in her a quality of attention that Miss Marple associated with people who have come somewhere for a purpose. Mr. Fitch chaired the reading group with his customary organisational efficiency. They were discussing a recent novel about an academic historian at a fictional Oxford college who discovers evidence of a long-buried institutional scandal, and Mr. Fitch's commentary on the historical research methods depicted was thorough and well considered. He was, as always, an excellent group leader, prepared, fair, drawing out quieter members, managing the more voluble ones. Nothing in his manner suggested anything other than a librarian doing something he genuinely enjoyed. Afterwards, over the biscuits and tea that Mr. Fitch provided with commendable regularity, Miss Marple manoeuvred through the small social shuffling of 8 people in a moderate-sized room and arrived beside Mrs. Norcott. "I haven't seen you at the fair before," she said pleasantly, "though I suppose I might have missed you. It was rather crowded on Saturday morning." "I arrived at noon," Mrs. Norcott said. "I only stayed briefly. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I find those are often the best visits. One finds the things one didn't know one wanted." Miss Marple paused, tilting her head slightly in the manner of someone following a train of thought. "I found a rather interesting diary, a personal one, belonging to someone called Ashwood, a family who were in Thornwick a few years ago." She said the name without emphasis, watching Mrs. Norcott with the same quality of attention she had given Mr. Fitch. The response was subtler than a pause. It was a small, controlled stillness, lasting perhaps a second, and then Mrs. Norcott said, "The name doesn't mean anything to me. Of course not. They left in 1950, so you'd have just missed them." Miss Marple smiled. "A sad story, apparently. The husband died in an accident. Fell on some old steps at the back of their house. The wife and their son left very soon after. Couldn't bear to stay, I imagine." "Very dreadful," Mrs. Norcott said, her voice perfectly level. But she had set down her biscuit without eating it, and she did not pick it up again. At the other end of the room, George Pemberton and Mr. Fitch were in conversation. Miss Marple observed this from her peripheral vision, apparently absorbed in Mrs. Norcott and her biscuit. The conversation between the two men had the lowered quality of men who are talking about something they would prefer not to have overheard in a public room. She could not hear the words from where she stood, but she could see that Pemberton was doing most of the talking, that he was using short, direct sentences rather than the relaxed lawyer's discursiveness he employed in the group discussion, and that Mr. Fitch's expression shifted during the exchange in 2 distinct directions, once into something that resembled irritation, and once into something that was, without any question, closer to fear. Clara Hartley, being deaf and therefore unconstrained by social norms around visible attention, was watching Pemberton and Fitch with frank interest. Miss Marple moved to sit near her. "Have Mr. Fitch and Mr. Pemberton always been close?" she asked, at the slightly elevated volume that Mrs. Hartley found useful. "Oh, they've had dealings for years," Mrs. Hartley said comfortably. "Pemberton handled the Ashwood estate, that property on the Marsh Road, the one with the fen garden. He managed the sale when it went last year. My nephew's friend does removal work with Penniston's company, and they did the clearance, so we heard about it at the time." "Pemberton handled the Ashwood estate," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "He was the solicitor for the family. There was no will, apparently. The man died intestate, and his affairs were in some confusion, so it took nearly 2 years before the property could be sold properly. Pemberton represented the widow, the wife." Mrs. Hartley said this with the mild disapproval of a woman who has always maintained that the proper preparation of a will was a basic moral obligation. "The boy had to be sorted out too. There were some questions about guardianship, I believe. A great deal of complication for a family already in distress," Miss Marple murmured. "An intestacy, with a young widow and a child. Exactly. It made everything much more difficult than it ought to have been. No will, research papers that vanished, a solicitor who was present immediately after the death, managing the estate, representing the widow." Miss Marple drank her tea and was careful to look at no one in particular. Chapter 5. The Accession Register. On the Thursday following the reading group, Miss Marple visited the library again. This time she came with a specific purpose that she had thought through with some care, and she was pleased to find that Mr. Fitch was engaged with a delivery at the back of the building, and that the desk was being managed by Daphne, his part-time assistant. Daphne was 20, studying at the Cambridge Technical College, and worked at the library on Thursdays and Fridays and occasional Saturdays. She was cheerful, competent within her narrow brief, and entirely without the attentive territorial quality that Mr. Fitch brought to every transaction in his library. Miss Marple explained, in a tone of warm and genuine interest, that she was considering donating a small collection of local history books to the library. She had a dear friend in Norfolk who was clearing a house, she explained, and there were several volumes on Cambridgeshire history and fen drainage that seemed more appropriate for a village library than a house clearance. She wondered if she might look at the library's existing accession records to avoid duplicating what they already held. Daphne, who had no instructions covering this eventuality, and no particular reason to doubt a respectable library member of 12 years' standing, brought the accession registers for 1949 through 1952 and set them on the reading room table without ceremony, then returned to her cataloguing. Miss Marple worked through the registers methodically, beginning with 1949 and moving forward, making occasional small notes in the margin of her pocket notebook, the names of genuine local history volumes she spotted, which she could subsequently inquire about and even attempt to donate, thus lending the whole enterprise legitimacy retroactively. This was the kind of careful preparation she found satisfying. The 1950 register was what she had come to see, and she gave it the attention it deserved. January and February held the ordinary run of library business, donated novels, reference acquisitions, a periodical subscription renewed, 3 sets of encyclopedias, the entries regular, brief, and in Mr. Fitch's neat, precise hand. March continued in the same pattern. The first 2 weeks of April showed nothing, a gap that might simply mean no new stock had arrived, which was not unusual. On the 19th of April, 4 days after the date recorded at Roland Ashwood's inquest as the date of his death, there was a single entry, and it was not like the others. It read, "Research documents re. Land tenure. Thornwick and Maltham parishes. C18 C19. Source, estate. Ref. A50, 1/17. Below the entry, written in a slightly different ink, added later, she thought, the pen having been re-dipped or replaced. was a diagonal red line, and, beside it, the word withdrawn. The date of withdrawal was absent. Every other withdrawal in the register, and she checked backward through 50 pages to verify this, had a date. Some had reasons: returned to donor, transferred to reference, damaged, removed. The entry for A51 Tour 17 had none of these, just the word and the red line and silence. 17 items. Research documents about land tenure in Thornwick and Maltham, spanning the 18th and 19th centuries, accessioned 4 days after Roland Ashwood's death. Source noted as estate, meaning the materials had come from his estate, from his personal papers, from Raven House. Miss Marple sat with this for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, looking at the register entry with the still concentration of a woman doing serious internal work. A librarian had acquired a dead man's research materials, catalogued them officially, and then withdrawn them with no date and no explanation. The entry existed, it was part of the permanent record, but the materials themselves had apparently vanished. And the same librarian had, 2 years later, put that dead man's private diary on a trestle table at a public book fair, and had claimed to know nothing about the torn-out pages. She wrote down the reference number, a 50-1 to 17, in her pocket notebook, between a note on the Trollope edition and a reminder to ask Mrs. Frobisher about the church hall's jumble sale schedule. Then she replaced the registers exactly as she had found them, returned to the desk to thank Daphne, and left. Chapter 6. Reverend Drummond and the Question of Research. The vicarage in Thornwick was a rambling Victorian building behind the church, too large for one man, which Reverend Drummond had occupied alone since his wife's death in 1947, and which he managed with the slightly apologetic competence of a man who has accepted that he is not domestically gifted, but is doing his best. He was 64, spare and thoughtful, with the kind of intellectual restlessness that had led him to read classics at Oxford and then to apply it to an unlikely career in a fenland parish, where it expressed itself in extremely well-researched sermons and a genuine interest in the area's history. Miss Marple had established, over 6 years of Sunday services and occasional parish committee work, a warm and mutually respectful relationship with him, and she arrived at the vicarage on Friday afternoon under the excellent cover of inquiring about the flower rota, which was a legitimate concern that needed addressing before Advent. They discussed the flower rota satisfactorily for 10 minutes, then drank tea, then fell naturally into the kind of ranging conversation that Reverend Drummond enjoyed, and Miss Marple had learned to guide with a light hand. "I've been interested this week in the history of the village," she said, "particularly the land tenure around the fen. It's such an unusual landscape, legally and practically. I gather the Drainage and Enclosure Acts created all sorts of complications with boundary ownership." "They did indeed," the vicar said, with the brightened expression of a man presented with a topic he has thought about. "The fenland parishes were particularly complex. The drainage works of the 17th and 18th centuries completely altered the physical landscape, and the ownership boundaries didn't always follow. There are still cases today where the documented title to a piece of land doesn't entirely match what the landscape actually shows. I imagine that must be rather valuable information if one were researching it carefully. Potentially, I had a man here not long ago, well, 3 years ago now, I suppose, who was doing exactly that. A Roland Ashwood. He came to look at the parish records, the old vestry accounts, that sort of thing." "Mr. Ashwood," Miss Marple spoke the name with the tone of mild recognition. "Yes, I've heard the name this week. He died rather tragically." "Yes, a sad case." The vicar was quiet for a moment. He was a thorough researcher, came twice to the vestry records, spent several hours each time. We had conversations about his work. He was interested in the documentary history of land grants in the fen parishes, specifically in the period from about 1740 to 1810. "What did he find? or was it too early in his research to say? Reverend Drummond considered. He had found something. He came to me in February or March of 1950. Late in the afternoon, as I recall. The light was already going, it was still winter really, and he was in a state of considerable intellectual excitement, the kind scholars get when they've found something significant. He said he had uncovered evidence that would be, and I remember this phrase exactly, rather inconvenient for certain families with long-standing interests in the parish. Did he say which families? He was careful not to. He said he needed to verify the evidence further. He didn't want to name names until he was certain. He mentioned the county archives in Cambridge and some other documentary source he was consulting. I assumed he meant a boundary dispute of some kind, or an error in an old grant. These things do happen, especially with fen land that shifted over the drainage works. And between that conversation and his death, did you see him again? Once, about 2 weeks before he died. He seemed different, less excited, more preoccupied. I asked how the research was progressing, and he said he had stepped into something larger than he'd anticipated. Those were his words. I pressed him a little, and he said the evidence pointed to something that had been maintained deliberately rather than simply overlooked, which is a rather significant distinction, of course. Miss Marple nodded. Maintained deliberately, not an old error, not an administrative mistake that had persisted through inattention, a deliberate falsification kept in place over generations by people who understood what they were maintaining. He trusted Mr. Fitch at the library, she said, very gently. He spoke well of Fitch, said he had been extraordinarily helpful with the extended loan arrangement and had provided access to some of the library's own historical holdings. I believe he was keeping some of his materials at the library for security. The vicar paused. That struck me as a reasonable precaution at the time. Now, I confess, I wonder about it. Land tenure research. Something inconvenient for certain families. Miss Marple set down her cup. Are there old land holdings in Thornwick that have any degree of controversy attached to them? The vicar looked at her steadily. The Pemberton family has farmed the South Fen for as long as anyone can remember, he said. Their holding is considerable. It's been the foundation of their prosperity and, more recently, of George Pemberton's legal practice. He manages several estates on the basis of his family's established position in the county. He paused again. I mention this only as a factual matter. I wouldn't want to imply anything that I couldn't support. Of course not, said Miss Marple. Facts are the important thing. She drove herself home. She had borrowed Mrs. Frobisher's bicycle, which made the return easier than the walk would have been in the late afternoon, and sat with her knitting for 2 hours, and by the time she set it down and went to make her supper, she had a very clear picture of the shape of everything. Not yet the proof, but the shape. Chapter 7. George Pemberton's Guarded Afternoon. She went to see George Pemberton on the following Monday. She had spent the weekend in careful thought and had decided that the direct approach, asking him specific questions, was less useful at this stage than the indirect approach, which would consist of conducting a legitimate legal consultation while observing very carefully how he responded to certain incidental subjects. This was a strategy that had served her before, and it required something Miss Marple possessed in quantity, the ability to be precisely as unthreatening and ordinary as she appeared, while simultaneously operating with complete purpose. She told Mr. Pemberton's secretary that she wished to review her will with a view to making some additions, specifically regarding her small book collection and her garden tools, which she wanted directed to specific people, and was given a Tuesday afternoon appointment. George Pemberton's office occupied the first floor of the building above the chemist's, reached by a narrow staircase that retained the ghost of the tobacco shop it had once been. The office itself was well appointed and businesslike, with a heavy desk, a good carpet, framed maps of the county on 2 walls, and a manner of professional orderliness that reminded her, slightly, of Mr. Fitch. They began with the will, and Miss Marple was brisk, sensible, and entirely cooperative, presenting her wishes clearly and asking practical questions. George Pemberton was at his professional best, warm without being familiar, efficient without being cold. He was good at his work, she noted. Genuinely good, not merely presentable. After 15 minutes, she introduced the subject of the Ashwood estate as though it had just surfaced in her mind. "I was told you handled the Ashwood estate, the property on the Marsh Road. I mention it only because I've been hearing about the family this week, and I believe they left rather suddenly." A shift in his manner. Not dramatic, he was far too controlled for drama, but perceptible. The relaxed professional warmth became slightly more deliberate. "I assisted the widow with the property, yes. It was all resolved several years ago. An intestacy, I gather. Complicated. These things can be. It was handled appropriately. I imagine you knew Roland Ashwood personally, small villages being what they are." "I met him through Mr. Fitch at the library, briefly. We were not close." He said this with the precision of a man choosing his words. "His research. Do you know, no one seems to know what it was about. He was apparently very private about it." I couldn't say. I knew very little about the man. The answer came a fraction faster than the previous ones, and there was apparently no record of any research materials in the estate inventory. His wife found them gone. Estate inventories are completed on the basis of what is present and documented at the time of administration. If materials had already been dispersed before the inventory. He stopped himself very slightly, the way a man stops himself when he has said something slightly more than he intended. "Of course," Miss Marple said, entirely pleasantly. "These things can be complicated. I'm glad it was all resolved properly." She returned to the will. They concluded the meeting on excellent terms. On the pavement afterwards, she stood in the afternoon light and considered what she had heard. If materials had already been dispersed before the inventory, he had not said there were no research materials. He had not said the inventory was complete. He had begun a sentence about the dispersal of materials before the inventory was compiled, and then he had heard himself and stopped. A careful man. A very careful man. But careful men had the same problem as careless ones. They could not always hear their own sentences with the precision that others could. Chapter 8. The Matter of Mrs. Norcott. She had been thinking about Mrs. Norcott since the reading group, and she had thought about her again after her conversation with Vera Ashwood's name, and by the end of the week she had formed a conclusion she wanted to test. On Friday afternoon she placed herself on the bench near the primary school gate at 4:15, her canvas bag beside her and the Josephine Tay open on her lap. Mrs. Norcott taught piano at the school on Fridays and finished at 4:30, and the walk home to her cottage behind the church took her directly past the bench. The afternoon was cool and pale, the October light already beginning to thin, and Miss Marple sat reading, genuinely reading, because the book was excellent, until Mrs. Norcott came through the school gate at 25 past, wrapped in a dark coat, her head slightly bent against the wind that came off the fen. "Mrs. Norcott," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "How nice. Are you walking home? Might I walk with you a little way?" They fell in together comfortably and talked of ordinary things for several minutes, the reading group's discussion, the book fair's better finds, the bonfire preparations at the school. And then Miss Marple said, in the quiet, careful tone she used when she was being most direct, "I want to say something to you, and I hope you won't be offended by it. I believe you may be Vera Ashwood." A silence of 4 complete steps. Then, quietly, "What makes you think so?" "Several things. You came to Thornwick in 1951, the year after Roland Ashwood's death, when his widow and son had left. There is no record of where they went. Your voice has a quality I associate with Somerset, and Vera Ashwood came originally from that county. You teach piano, and Roland Ashwood's wife was described to me as musical. Your name, Norcott, sounds like a mother's maiden name, and when I mentioned the Ashwood name at the reading group, you reacted in a way that suggested recognition you were suppressing." Another silence. "Norcott was my grandmother's maiden name." Her voice was flat and very tired. I came back. I needed to understand what happened. I couldn't simply go on living somewhere else and not knowing. What do you believe happened? Vera Ashwood, for she was that, now confirmed, turned to look at Miss Marple. Her grey-green eyes in the late light were very direct. Roland didn't fall by accident. He was frightened in the last weeks of his life. He wouldn't tell me the details of what he'd found. He said it was safer for me not to know, but I knew it was something serious. He'd made an arrangement with Mr. Fitch to keep his research materials secured at the library. He said that no one would interfere with material held in official trust. She paused. He was wrong about that. And after he died, the materials were gone. Everything. Fitch said he'd taken it all home weeks earlier. Roland said no such thing to me. His desk at home was empty. His notebooks were gone. Everything he'd been working on for a year and a half had simply ceased to exist. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness required effort. I left because I couldn't bear to be there, and because Philip needed to be away from it. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. When I came back last year, I told myself I wanted to understand. I think the truth is that I wanted to be close to whatever was left of him. Did you know about Mr. Pemberton's involvement? I suspected it. Roland had mentioned, once, that he'd found something that touched on a local family's interests. He used that phrase, touched on their interests. He didn't name them, but Pemberton came to the house the morning after the inquest. He said he was there in his professional capacity, to discuss the estate. I thought that was normal. I understand now that it wasn't. The morning after the inquest, Miss Marple said, before the estate had even formally been identified as intestate. Yes. Vera's voice was very quiet. He knew there was no will before anyone had confirmed it. He must have known. They walked in silence for a moment. The fen lane curved towards the church, and the pale sky above it was darkening. What did Roland's research actually show? Miss Marple asked. He found forged documents in the county archives, land deeds for the South Fen, the Pemberton family's principal holding, that had been altered or created fraudulently in the 1750s. The land title had never been legitimate. It was an enormous holding, hundreds of acres, and if the title was voided, the Pemberton family would lose the land that underpinned everything, the farm income, the professional reputation, the legal practice itself. She paused. He was going to write it up and submit it to an academic journal and to the county authorities. He thought it was simply a historical matter. He didn't understand until very late that for the Pembert family it was not historical at all. It was present-day survival. Miss Marple nodded. He confronted them. He told me he'd written a letter to George Pemberton, the son, not the father who was the senior solicitor, informing him of his findings and giving him an opportunity to respond before publication. He felt that was the ethical thing to do. She stopped walking. He was an ethical man. It never occurred to him that ethical behavior in this situation was also dangerous behavior. Chapter 9. The Back Door. On Saturday morning, Miss Marple woke at 6:30 and lay in the early dark thinking about the diary and the torn pages and the question she had not yet answered. Where were the 17 research documents referenced in the accession register? They had been withdrawn, removed from the record. But had they been destroyed? Or were they still in the library, hidden somewhere that a careful librarian would consider secure? She thought about this for 20 minutes, then got up and made tea and toast, and thought about it further while she ate breakfast and looked out at the grey October garden. Then she put on her coat and hat, took her canvas bag, and walked into the village. The library was closed. This was in itself unusual. The library was open on Saturdays from 10 to 4, had been for as long as anyone could remember, and Mr. Fitch was not a man who closed casually. A notice on the door, written in his neat hand, said, "Closed, unforeseen circumstances, open Monday." Miss Marple stood on the pavement and considered the notice with the same attention she would have given to a misplaced garden implement or an unusual bird visiting the wrong feeder. She walked around to the side passage between the library and the chemist's. a narrow brick-floored lane barely wide enough for two people to pass each other. At the far end, the back of the library building presented a rear door, rarely used, she knew, for the occasional delivery that couldn't come through the main entrance. The door had a frosted glass panel in its upper half and a single stone step below it. The door was not locked. It was not quite open either, but it was not fully closed. It stood a half-inch from its frame, enough to make it clear that someone was inside and had entered this way. From inside the building, at a distance she estimated as the back office, behind the main reading room, she could hear two male voices. She could hear that they were having a conversation of intensity, and she could hear the general tenor, clipped, controlled, low. She did not go in. She moved close to the frosted glass and stood beside it, not looking through it. The frosting prevented this in any case, but listening. Anyone at all to see it. Mr. Fitch's voice, tight with something between anger and anxiety. "I told you years ago to destroy the whole lot." Pemberton, controlled, each word precise. The diary, the photographs, the register entry, all of it. "You told me." A pause waited with old resentment. "I told you that I wasn't prepared to leave myself with nothing. You call that nothing? You've been sitting on material evidence in a murder case for 2 years. There was no murder case." Fitch's voice cracked slightly. "There was an inquest. There was an accidental death. Don't be naive with me." Pemberton's voice was very flat, very controlled. "The old woman was at the register. Daphne told me. She spent 40 minutes with the 1950 register." Silence. "She's just an elderly lady who borrows library books," Fitch said. His voice had lost its firmness. "She is a great deal more than that," Pemberton said. "Where is the diary now?" "In the drawer, the locked drawer. And the photographs?" A pause. "They're secure." "Where?" "Here. Somewhere she wouldn't find them." "Is there a duplicate register entry anywhere else?" "Anywhere she could see the original reference." "The register is the register. There's only one." Another silence. Then Pemberton. "We need to deal with this today." "I won't," Fitch began. "I'm not asking what you will or won't do. I am telling you that this needs to be addressed today. Both the material and the woman." Miss Marple had been entirely still throughout this exchange, her back against the library wall, her canvas bag on her arm, her face quite expressionless. At the phrase "both the material and the woman," she experienced a mild internal quickening that she recognized as the signal that it was time to stop listening and start moving. She was old enough and experienced enough to know the difference between a man speaking from desperation and a man making a plan, and Pemberton had moved from the former into the latter in the course of that last sentence. She walked to the end of the passage, turned onto the high street, and walked at her usual pace, not fast, not slow, but purposeful, to the police station at the far end of the high street. Chapter 10. Inspector Craddock. Detective Inspector Dermot Craddock had come to Thornwick for the weekend to visit his sister Frances, who had lived in the village since her marriage 12 years ago, and kept a very good kitchen garden that Craddock found soothing to walk around after a week in Cambridge. He was 37, lean, with a thoughtful face, and the quality of patience that made him good at extended investigations. He had encountered Miss Marple 2 years earlier in connection with a matter at St. Mary Mead, and he had formed an opinion of her that he would have found difficult to express adequately to anyone who hadn't met her. Something along the lines of, "Treat every word she says as if it came from a far more officially credentialed source, and still act faster than you think necessary." He was therefore not inclined to disbelief when his sister called him to the telephone at 11:30 on a Saturday morning and said a Miss Marple wished to speak to him on a matter of some urgency. He met her at the police station 20 minutes later. The Thornwick constable, Aldous, was present and taking notes. Miss Marple sat very straight in the interview room chair, her canvas bag on the table, and set out everything she knew with the precision and economy of someone who has organized a great deal of material and is presenting only what is necessary. Roland Ashwood's research into fraudulent land tenure. The Pemberton family title to the South Fen. The meeting Ashwood had arranged with George Pemberton in April 1950. The accidental death 2 days after that meeting. The disappearance of the research materials. The library accession register entry for 17 research documents, accessioned 4 days after the death, withdrawn without date or reason. The diary, its library stamp, its torn pages, its presence on the fair table. The conversation she had just heard through the library's back door. Craddock listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for 10 seconds, which she considered a reasonable processing time, given the volume of information. The phrase he used, Craddock said, both the material and the woman. Yes, he meant me, and he meant the diary and the photographs. I believe those are the 17 items in the register, photographic copies of the documentary evidence Roland Ashwood found in the county archives. You think they're still in the library? Fitch said they were secure and that they were somewhere I wouldn't find them, which suggests they are not in an obvious location. The library has its main collection, the reading room, the back office, and the cellar, which is used for archive storage of the library's historical records. I believe the photographs may be in the accession register itself, which is the most obvious hiding place for a librarian, a document concealed within documents. Craddock looked at Constable Aldous. We need a warrant. And you'll need Cambridge County Archive records, Miss Marple added. The original documents that Roland Ashwood was photographing should still be there. The forgeries in the original deeds. Those would be the foundation of any land fraud case. You've been busy, Craddock said, with a look that contained both admiration and the slight exasperation of a professional who has been forestalled by an amateur. I have simply been paying attention, Miss Marple said, which is all I've ever done. Chapter 11. The Warrant. Craddock moved quickly, which was one of his best qualities. By 2 o'clock on Saturday, he had telephoned Cambridge and arranged for a search warrant on the basis of his own professional credibility and a sufficiently alarming summary of the situation. By 4 o'clock, 2 constables from the Cambridge station had arrived in Thornwick. By 5, the warrant had been executed. Mr. Fitch was at the library when they arrived. He offered no resistance. He was pale and very still, and he said almost nothing. The locked drawer in his desk yielded the diary. The locked cupboard in the back office yielded files that had no relevance. The cellar, which had indeed been used for archive storage, yielded several large cardboard boxes of old parish and library records. And within one of these boxes, inside a manila envelope that had been placed between 2 bound volumes of the library's 1939 and 1940 annual reports, there were 17 small photographic prints. Each print was approximately 4 inches by 3, taken with what a later examination confirmed was a Minox subminiature camera, the kind used by researchers who needed to photograph archival documents in libraries that did not permit copying. Each showed a historical document, land deeds, grant records, boundary surveys, signatures and seals, covering the period 1751 to 1789. All were legible. All were, as subsequent expert examination confirmed, images of documents that were still present in the Cambridgeshire County Archive under their original reference numbers, and slipped inside the front cover of the diary, not loose but folded and tucked, in a way that suggested it had been placed there deliberately for preservation, was a sheet of paper in Roland Ashwood's hand, dated the 13th of April, 1950. Miss Marple, shown it by Craddock, read it with the steady attention it deserved. It was addressed to no one. It was written in the plain, precise style of an academic making a record for his own future reference. It read, in part, I have written to G.P., informing him of my findings and their implications. I have given him a period of 1 week to respond before I proceed to formal submission. He has requested a meeting at Raven House on Monday evening, the 15th. I have agreed, though I have told Fitch to ensure that all materials remain at the library until the matter is resolved. I have shown Pemberton only a summary of the findings. The originals, both the photographs and my written analysis, remain with Fitch in the secure arrangement. I consider this a reasonable precaution. The evidence in the archive speaks for itself, regardless of what happens to my copies. The 14th of April would have been Sunday. The 15th, the meeting, would have been Monday evening. The inquest recorded his death as occurring on the night of the 15th. Craddock read the document and then looked up at the constable beside him. "Find George Pemberton," he said. Chapter 12. What George Pemberton said. George Pemberton did not run. Miss Marple had suspected he would not. He was not a man who panicked in the obvious ways. He was at his house on the Maltham Road when the constables arrived at 6 o'clock on Saturday evening, and he came with them without incident. And at the Cambridge station on Sunday morning, he gave a controlled and carefully measured account of events that was, in its own way, a masterpiece of qualified admission. He admitted to the meeting on the evening of the 15th of April 1950. He admitted that it had taken place in the Fen Garden at Raven House. He admitted that he and Roland Ashwood had argued. He described it as a heated discussion about the implications of Ashwood's research and what Ashwood intended to do with it. He admitted that during this argument they had been near the old stone steps. He denied pushing Ashwood. He maintained, in language that had the precise quality of something that had been prepared over a long period of time, that Ashwood had slipped during the argument, had lost his footing on the wet stone, which was entirely plausible given the condition of those steps, and had fallen before Pemberton could prevent it. He had panicked, he said. He was 24 years old, and he had panicked, and he had made the catastrophically wrong decision to leave without reporting it, and he had spent 12 years in the knowledge that this was the worst decision of his life. He admitted to approaching Mr. Fitch on the morning of the 16th. He admitted that Fitch had already secured the research materials from the library arrangement. He admitted that he had made a financial arrangement with Fitch, not a payment in money, he was insistent on this, but a formal agreement about the management of the Pemberton estate land, which gave Fitch certain income-dependent interests, in exchange for the concealment of the documents. He denied that any of this constituted premeditation. He denied that the concealment of evidence had been planned before the meeting on the 15th. He was, throughout the interview, composed and precise, and deeply frightening in the way that only very controlled people can be frightening, because you could not see what was underneath the control, and you were not certain you wanted to. Craddock, who was an experienced interviewer, said afterwards that Pemberton's account had the quality of something that had been maintained in a person's own mind for 12 years through repeated rehearsal, told to himself often enough that he had come to believe the version in which panic was the operative force rather than calculation. Whether a jury would share that belief remained to be seen. Mr. Fitch, interviewed separately, broke far more quickly. He was not, at heart, a man of Pemberton's calibre for sustained falsehood. He wept at several points. He told everything he knew, including several things that Pemberton had not told them, and the picture that emerged from the combination of both accounts was one that Miss Marple had largely assembled on her own over the course of 1 week's careful attention. Chapter 13. The Shape of Things. Miss Marple had tea with Inspector Craddock on Sunday afternoon, at his sister Frances's kitchen table, where Frances had provided a very good fruit cake and the good sense to leave them to talk. "The land fraud charges are more straightforward than the murder question," Craddock said. "The photographic evidence is clear, the original documents are in the archive, and there are experts at Cambridge who will testify about the forgeries. The Pemberton family's land title on the South Fen has been fraudulent for 200 years. George Pemberton knew it, his father knew it before him, and probably his grandfather before that. The question of who first committed the fraud in 1751 is essentially historical. And the current question," Miss Marple said, is whether George Pemberton murdered Roland Ashwood or merely failed to prevent an accident and then covered it up. Exactly, his version, an argument, a slip, a panic, a catastrophic decision, is not impossible. The steps were genuinely dangerous. The conditions on an April evening in a fen garden would have been wet and uneven. An accidental slip is physically plausible. It is, Miss Marple agreed. But a man who goes to a meeting knowing the other party intends to destroy his family's livelihood, and who has sought that meeting himself, and who then, by his own account, watches that party fall to his death without rendering any assistance and without reporting it, is not making a panic decision alone. He made at least 3 consecutive decisions in the dark, each one of which extended the first, and each one of which required a degree of rational deliberation that is difficult to reconcile with blind panic. Craddock looked at her. "You believe it was murder?" "I believe something was intended that evening that was not an accident. I cannot tell you precisely what happened in the dark on those steps, and nor, I think, can anyone else now. But I can tell you that when a man arranges a private meeting with another man who poses an existential threat to everything his family has, and that man dies that same evening, and the first man spends the next 12 years ensuring that no evidence of either the meeting or the research survives, the pattern of behavior is not consistent with a person who experienced a genuine accident and made a frightened wrong choice. It is consistent with a person who achieved a desired outcome and spent 12 years maintaining the conditions that made it achievable." Craddock was quiet. "That's very clearly put. I find it helpful to say things clearly," said Miss Marple, "particularly when they are unpleasant. What about Fitch? You believe he was not present?" "I believe he was not present at the death, no. He was useful to Pemberton, the most useful possible person, because he had custody of materials that could have destroyed Pemberton, and he was therefore easily pressured. A man who has already made one morally indefensible decision is far easier to recruit to the second and third. I think Fitch came to the library the morning of the 16th, knowing approximately what had happened. Pemberton would have been sufficiently direct with him, and made the calculation of a frightened, self-interested man. He took the materials into official custody, creating a paper record that gave him a degree of protection, and then withdrew them from official record, removing them from public access. He kept the diary as his own security, evidence that he had something, should Pemberton ever decide to remove the one person who could implicate him, his own insurance. Yes, though a rather dangerous kind. It required him to maintain an equilibrium with a man who had already demonstrated a willingness to let another person die for his own interests. He put the diary in the fair. I believe he had decided to bring everything to light, but lacked the courage to do it directly. Putting the diary on the table, accessible to the public, attributable to accident, was a way of starting a process he couldn't start himself. He hoped, I think, that someone else would do the difficult part. She paused. Someone did. Chapter 14. Vera Ashwood Speaks. She came to Miss Marple's cottage on Monday evening, the week after the arrests. She came alone, having first written a brief, careful note asking if she might call, and she arrived at 7 o'clock with a small bunch of late dahlias from her garden that she offered with the slightly apologetic air of a woman who is not sure how to express gratitude properly. Miss Marple put the dahlias in water, made tea, and they sat by the fire in the parlour while the autumn dark settled outside. Vera Ashwood, she had told Constable Aldous her real name, and there seemed no longer any reason to continue with Norcott, was quieter than she had been on the lane by the school. The urgency that had animated her that afternoon was gone, replaced by something that might have been relief, and might have been exhaustion, and was probably both. "Philip is coming at the weekend," she said. "He's at London University, law. He knows the outline of what's happened. I've written to him." She paused. "He's the right age now to understand what he wasn't old enough to understand when Roland died. He was 12. I protected him from most of it." "That was very right," Miss Marple said. 12 is not an age for that kind of knowledge. He remembers his father clearly, though, perhaps more clearly than I do in some ways. Children keep very specific things. He remembers Roland reading to him in the evenings, and the smell of his study, and that Roland always had 3 reference books open at once and consulted them in order. She smiled for the first time, briefly and genuinely. He wants to understand the land title question from a legal perspective. He says that whatever happens to Pemberton in terms of the murder charge, the fraudulent title needs to be challenged in a civil action, and the legitimate heirs need to be found. That is a very lawyerly response, Miss Marple said. Roland would have been proud of him, Vera said. Her voice was steady. I believe he would. He was an honest man, genuinely honest, which is rarer than people think. He found something true, and he wanted to do the honest thing with it. He didn't have the instinct for self-protection that might have served him better. No, Miss Marple said quietly. Honest people rarely do. Mr. Fitch came to see me, Vera said, after a moment. Or tried to. His solicitor sent a letter asking if I would be willing to receive a communication. I said no, not yet. Perhaps not ever. I don't know yet what to do with what I feel about him. That is entirely your prerogative. He kept the diary. That was the thing that mattered in the end, that he kept it. It might have been for entirely selfish reasons, his own security, as you've described. But he kept it. She held her teacup with both hands. I'm not sure how to feel about a man who committed a great moral failure and then, in his own insufficient way, preserved the only evidence of the truth. It is a complicated thing to feel, Miss Marple agreed. Human beings rarely provide us with situations that are uncomplicated to feel about. It is one of their more challenging qualities. Vera looked at her with a slight, real smile. Is that how you manage it? Accepting the complications? I have found, Miss Marple said, that the complications are very often the most interesting part. They are where the actual human being lives, as opposed to the convenient version of the human being that we sometimes prefer to see. She paused. Your husband understood that about historical research, I think. He knew the documents were more complicated than simple forgeries. They were part of someone's survival, maintained across generations. He wanted to tell the truth about them anyway. That took a particular kind of courage. It did, Vera said. It did. They sat in companionable quiet for a little while, and the fire settled, and outside the fen was dark and wide under a sky beginning to show stars. Chapter 15. The Library Under New Management. In November, Daphne, who had given Craddock the information about the register visit without entirely understanding its significance, and who was therefore guiltless, was appointed temporary librarian pending a permanent appointment. She managed the library with cheerful competence and a healthy disregard for several of Mr. Fitch's more rigid procedural preferences, and the members of the reading group, who had half expected to feel the loss of his organization, found instead that the library functioned perfectly adequately without being treated as a temple. George Pemberton was charged with both the murder of Roland Ashwood and the conspiracy to defraud by concealing evidence relating to the fraudulent land title. The murder charge, as Craddock had anticipated, was the more contested. Pemberton's account of an accidental fall maintained its plausibility in the absence of direct witnesses, and the prosecution would need to establish criminal intent through a pattern of behavior that was circumstantial rather than direct. The fraud charges were considerably simpler, backed as they were by the photographic evidence and the county archive documents and the testimony of 3 separate expert witnesses on historical land deeds. Mr. Fitch was charged as an accessory after the fact to both offences. His cooperation with the investigation, his detailed testimony about what Pemberton had told him on the morning after the death, about the arrangement they had made, about the subsequent 12 years of maintenance, was considered in his favour by the prosecution, but did not protect him from the charges themselves. The civil question of the fraudulent Pemberton land title was, as Philip Ashwood had predicted when he arrived at the weekend and spent 3 hours reading the photographic evidence in his mother's sitting room, with the intense focus of a young man discovering simultaneously what his father had found and why it had killed him, a matter for a separate legal process. He identified, through consultation with a Norwich solicitor, a family in Norfolk named Cardew, who were the documented heirs to the original pre-enclosure grant, and the process of establishing their claim was initiated. Vera Ashwood, who had, by the end of October, resumed using her real name, remained in Thornwick. She had come back to find something and had found more than she had expected, and there was, in that, a complicated kind of peace. Chapter 16. Miss Marple on the November Lane. November came to Thornwick with the particular grey peace of the flat eastern counties in late autumn, when the sky and the fen and the stripped fields settle into a harmony of muted colour, and the village turns inward to its fires and its winter routines. Miss Marple walked her morning lane in the pale light, her coat buttoned against the wind, her canvas bag over her arm, out of habit rather than necessity, and thought about things in the pleasant, retrospective way that follows the conclusion of something difficult. She thought about the book fair and the diary on the trestle table, and the moment she had picked it up, she thought about the library stamp on the cover, that small, nearly invisible mark that had been the thread she had pulled. She thought about what it meant that a man had stamped a private document with a library's own seal of ownership, the fundamental human difficulty with letting go of something known to be important, even when its presence is dangerous, even when logic demands its destruction, even when everything practical argues for burning it and being done. Mr. Fitch had not destroyed it. He had stamped it, catalogued it, withdrawn it from the record, hidden it in a register, locked the diary in a drawer, and put it on a table at a public fair. Each of these actions was a form of preservation, dressed as a form of concealment, and the paradox at the heart of them was the paradox at the heart of guilty knowledge. You cannot truly hide what you have not been able to stop caring about. She passed the library building and looked at it for a moment. The new hour's notice in the window was in Daphne's rather rounder handwriting. Through the window she could see the reading room chairs arranged in their circle, the 3 leather ones and 5 wooden, and the spines of the books on the far wall, orderly as ever. A library stamped its stock. It did not stamp private diaries, and when it did stamp one, it was because the person with the stamp had needed, in some part of themselves, to claim the thing officially, to say, "This is real, this matters, this is not to be lost," even when the thing was something they desperately needed to lose. That was what had caught her attention, and she trusted her attention, after 71 years, well enough to follow where it led. She thought about Vera Ashwood, and about Roland Ashwood, and about the kind of courage it takes to find something true, and intend to do something honest with it, in a world where truth can be genuinely dangerous. She thought about Philip Ashwood, reading his father's photographic evidence at his mother's kitchen table, learning simultaneously who his father had been and what it had cost him. She thought about the Norfolk family, who would learn, in the course of the coming months, that they had an inheritance they had known nothing about, and whose lives would therefore change in ways they could not yet anticipate. She thought about Mr. Fitch, who had spent 12 years as the keeper of a secret that was destroying him from the inside, and who had ended by putting it in a canvas bag and sending it to a church hall, because there is only so long that a human being can go on being the custodian of a wrong that they know to be a wrong. She did not feel warmth toward him, precisely, but she felt something that was not entirely without charity. She turned in at her own gate. The dahlias in the border had gone over entirely, the last of them brown-headed and listing. She would need to lift the tubers before the first proper frost, which might come any week now. The garden was full of necessary tasks, which was one of its great virtues. She let herself in at her front door and hung her coat and hat on the hook behind it, and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. There was a letter on the mat from Philip Ashwood, brief and formal in the way of young men who are not yet entirely sure how to express themselves in writing. thanking her for what she had done. She read it twice, folded it, and set it on the mantelpiece. She made her tea and took it to the parlour chair by the window and looked out at the November garden and thought, as she sometimes did at the conclusion of something, about the nature of villages. About the way a village accumulates its knowledge of itself, the way a library accumulates its books. Steadily, over time, each edition both a record and a concealment, the whole becoming simultaneously more complete and harder to read. She had lived in villages all her life, and she had never lost her sense of wonder at the depth of what could be hidden in plain sight. Not in grand institutions or in the machinery of great events, but in a librarian's careful habits, in a diary's missing pages, in the faded stamp on a piece of green Moroccan leather. People left their traces everywhere, in their registers and their records, in their pauses and their hesitations, in the things they chose to keep when they would have been wiser to destroy, and the things they chose to hide when they would have been wiser to show. You simply had to look. She drank her tea. Outside, the fen stretched under a pale sky going grey at the edges, and a heron moved in slow, unhurried flight above the last of the autumn grasses, heading somewhere she could not see. It had been, she reflected, a very instructive week. End